Perfect. So getting into all the fun of what has really made us scratch our heads in the industry since they first came out with this, honestly, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. That seemed like it was put together a little hastily, that we came up with this new term, specified service trade or business. What in the world is this? In fact, it was so generic that we had many pages that was in the proposed and the final regs and the corrected final regs, all surrounding this term, specified service trade or business. Well, what they're looking for, and just to not let you worry too much, all this really affects is limitations if somebody has too much income. So we'll get more into that, but let's look at what their final definition is. They define this as a trade or business involving the performance of services in the fields of, and here's a variety of them, health and law, accounting, actuarial science, performing arts, consulting, athletics, and we're going to touch on each of these too, by the way, so don't worry too much yet. Financial services, brokerage services, they've done a lot to define all these financial services, or any trade or business where the principal asset of the trade or business is the reputation or skill of one or more of the employees or owners, or services that consist of investing or investment management, trading, again, a lot more definition in that financial aspect, dealing in securities, partnership interests, or commodities. So, big field of different types of things they consider a specified service trade or business. It is kind of curious. It used to include engineering and architecture as part of some of the original code they took these definitions from, but they removed them. And I don't know if that's presumably because they offer some sort of a physical deliverable in the form of engineering plans or blueprints, or aren't solely a service business, or they just have much better lobbyists. But those two particular types of fields are excluded from this specified service trade or business rule. I know it seems like a lot. What I want to do is break down each one of those areas, but again, just to come back to just kind of a moment to pause and say, well, wait, when is this really important? It only really matters for those taxpayers that are over the taxable income thresholds. So even if they are classified as a specified service trade or business because they're in one of those fields, being under those thresholds still isn't a problem. They will still get their QBI deduction. In fact, some of the IRS estimates think that almost 97% of taxpayers, the individuals are going to be under those thresholds. So it is one of those things that, yeah, we have to kind of understand it and know what we're doing in this regard, but it isn't something we have to panic over either. It is true that a lot of this new rule set in law, normally in the past, we can do returns that we just calculate and punch numbers in, but this does require a decision, and it is a little uncomfortable as preparers that we have to make decisions, and that we're making this decision at the business level. So if it's a flow-through entity, a corporation, partnership, what have you, we're making that decision at that entity level, regardless of what the effect is on the taxpayers. So it is a little uncomfortable, but keep in mind, don't let this be like a panic moment, because anyone that's under the threshold, it honestly doesn't truly matter. Now, with that said, we still do have to understand this, of course, because there are going to be some that it does matter. The regulations help to give some great guidance. However, if we look and say, as the industry, we have issued so many requests to them, and I even get lots of requests saying, is this specific business defined as an SSTB? What the IRS said is a determination of whether a specific business is, and for ease of this course, I'll say SSTB instead of the whole specified service trade or business. We're looking for very specific bright line definitions, and they say, well, the determination of whether it is depends on the facts and circumstances. If those facts and circumstances demonstrate that it's one of those fields. So kind of a generic answer, honestly. And they also further said, although the Treasury Department and the IRS understands the desire for that certainty, because that determination of whether a particular trade or business is an SSTB, well, unfortunately, that's factually dependent and beyond the scope of the regulations. So it really wasn't that they came out and said, okay, this exact type of business is and isn't and is and isn't. What they did is they helped to define the fields a little bit more. So this is still, again, it's up to us as practitioners to look at those facts and circumstances and see if they break down into those particular fields. They further said that Section 199A looks to the trade or business of performing services involving one or more of those fields. So they're looking at the big category, you can say. They're looking if they're in those fields or industries and not at the really tiny, definitions of the services themselves. So they're looking at the higher level, the industry level. The designation, though, of that SSTB, where does it really apply? It applies to the owners, whether the owner is passive or participated. So it doesn't really matter. Remember, we said before, there isn't any of the material participation rules. So it doesn't really matter whether that owner is materially participating or they're passive or whether they participated in any form. But the definition of, okay, this business I'm going to mark on the K1 or the form or wherever you're doing that in your tax software as an SSTB, that's going to flow through, and the owners are going to possibly be limited if their income is too high. That's really the effect of it, is it could limit the deduction. Now, there is a little bit of a side note I want to throw in here, because we'll talk about this more in a little bit. As we talked about, okay, what about a blended activity? What if it's a little of both? Maybe they're doing some SSTB activity and some not. So let's say they sell product and they also do a little bit of one of those defined services we're going to get into. But if it's low enough, we have this thing called a Minimis Rule that keeps us from having to call it a specified service, trade, or business. The way that works is you look at your gross receipts. For the smaller businesses out there, meaning the gross receipts are under 25 million, they're not going to be classified as an SSTB if less than 10% of their total gross receipts come from an SSTB activity. For the bigger businesses, they give us a lower threshold. So if you're over 25 million, you're not going to be classified as an SSTB if under 5% is participating in SSTB activity. So they came out with this rule because, as sometimes people do blended or different activities, the entire activity for the entity is either specified service, trade, or business or not. You don't get to prorate it. You don't get to mix and match. It is either, it's an all or nothing. Either it is or it isn't. So this rule at least kind of helped to say, well, what if there's a portion that is? They're like, okay, no problem. You don't have to classify it as an SSTB if it's under 10% for the smaller businesses. So we have something to go off of. If it's more, then it's going to be an SSTB. It's all or nothing. So that's a little bit just to kind of get into when we're getting into the actual defining those fields and getting into those a little bit more, is you could have one where it's a little mix and match, but look at how much they're doing in that specified activity versus everything else. And if it's under that 10% mark or 5% mark, if they're a much bigger business, you're okay. Anything over that, it's going to be all SSTB activity. So looking into some of these fields, and we'll go to a few before we take our next little break here. As we look at each one of these separate little categories or listed fields as they are. Included, when we just think of the health category, doctors and pharmacists, nurses, dentists, veterinarians. I found that one really curious, and reading the section of the final regulations explain why they consider veterinarians part of it. But physical therapists, psychologists, and other similar healthcare professionals. So seems generic. They used to have this terminology right after that said, who provide medical services directly to a patient. The final regs cut that wording. So it doesn't say that wording anymore. So one of the examples in a lot of the comments said, what about an x-ray tech? They now, because the final regs cut that wording, they don't meet with a patient. They're not, providing those services directly to a patient. They actually may be, again, under these rules. So it is curious to see the little subtle changes between the original law and the proposed and the final regs, but it just says that top section, psychologists, therapists, etc., and other similar healthcare professionals. Now they go ahead and give us a little bit more about who isn't included, at least. They say people who provide services that might improve the health of the recipient, like an operator of a health club or spa, that's not really health field related, or research, testing, and sale of pharmaceuticals or medical devices, that's really not the specified service of health, according to what they're looking for. But then they came out with a little bit of, they did a lot of examples, and they came out with some different information in the proposed and final regs, and they said, well, an assisted living facility or surgery center, it may or may not be health. So we say, why? Well, it's the unrelated health services, because some provide services unrelated to healthcare, like think of your assisted living facility that has housing and meals, laundry facilities, security, socialization activities where they go and maybe play all cards together on Thursday evenings. Or they may even make an independent contractor available for healthcare services without the facility receiving this revenue. So they said, well, there is a possibility those may not be in this area. But how can we really tell the difference? They recommend separating it, separate books and records again. Separating out with separate books and records the facility portion, so like what are they doing for the meals and security, socialization, etc., versus actual medical. So they did this example as well to say, really, it's facts and circumstances. Does it fall within this field or this heading? They didn't want to say this exact business is or isn't. They're trying to give us fields. So that's also what I'm trying to impart to you, is there's not like we can go down some giant list and say, okay, this business is or isn't, or go off of some sort of a industry classification code, because it doesn't really work that way. We have to look at what they're doing. What are the facts and circumstances of that business? And your assisted living facility or surgery center is a great example. Is kind of they aren't, but they could be as well. So looking at it, or if they're combined, what about that 10% rule? Where are they at in that whole entire scheme of things? The field or the section of law, well, they said included in that, we're going to include lawyers, paralegals, legal arbitrators, mediators, and other similar professionals. Not included is somebody that's just maybe on the peripheral. They're performing some printing services or delivering papers, stenography services. It's not really that they wanted to consider that law or in the field of law, that those are just kind of related services. They really didn't have much comment in the field of law. I found interesting. There was no change between the proposed and the final regulations in this case. Accounting? Well, folks, this is basically us. What are they including? Accountants, enrolled agents, return preparers, financial auditors, and similar professionals. They had a lot of language in there saying that, because some were saying, well, I don't have a CPA license, I'm not accredited, that I should fall out of this category. And they said our aim is to capture the understanding of accounting, which does include tax return and bookkeeping services, and is not in any way limited to services requiring licensure, because they said, that you could have somebody performing those same services that is licensed versus unlicensed. They did go and say not included is if they're just doing payment processing service or billing analysis, but all of the other areas in there, they're going to say that is accounting and that is a specified service, trade, or business. So folks, that does mean us. They were pretty clear in making sure to encompass all of that. So again, you look at what are the services actually performed, and it falls in that field. That's what they're looking for, not saying a particular industry classification code or a particular type. It is the field of accounting is what they're looking for here.